Good evening. Today marks 5 years since Britain left the EU. Well, the Brexit result came as a shock to many. Campaigning on both sides was tough, uncompromising and polarising, dividing the country and causing deep disagreements, often within families. And what has happened over the last 5 years, politically, socially and economically, has been viewed through a similarly divided lens. On one side, they celebrate the return of sovereignty and dismiss the current economic challenges the UK is facing as largely incidental to Brexit. The other side, meanwhile, blames leaving the EU for setting the country on the wrong course politically, while simultaneously harming trade, growth and market confidence. Well, tonight we look at both sides of the divide. But first, we look back now at the Brexit story so far.
Today, we mark 5 years since the United Kingdom left the European Union, a historic moment that redefined the nation's place in the world. Brexit was not a sudden decision, but the culmination of decades of political debate, shifting public opinion and complex negotiations. In this report, we trace the key events that led to Brexit and explore how it unfolded. The UK joined the European Economic Community, or EEC, in 1973, viewing membership as an economic opportunity. However, the relationship was contentious from the start. In 1975, a referendum was held to confirm the UK's membership, with 67% voting to remain. But tensions over sovereignty and EU integration persisted. In the 1980s, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher strongly opposed the EU gaining more power, particularly policies that could limit the UK's economic control. Her stance aligned with rising Euroscepticism within the Conservative Party.
Chairman or the President of the Commission, Mr. Delors, said at press conference the other day that he wanted the European Parliament to be the democratic body of the community, he wanted the Commission to be the executive, and he wanted the Council of Ministers to be the Senate. No, no, no.
The Maastricht Treaty of 1992 marked a turning point. It transformed the EEC into the European Union, introducing the concept of unified political and economic structure. Many in the UK saw this as a step too far, fueling demands for the country to reclaim its sovereignty.
Economic and monetary union.
The EU's 2004 enlargement, which welcomed 10 new member states, further stoked public debate. The influx of workers from these countries, particularly from Eastern Europe, raised concerns about immigration and its impact on wages, public services and social cohesion. This period saw the rise of the UK Independence Party, led by Nigel Farage, whose central platform was leaving the EU.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
In 2013, Prime Minister David Cameron, under pressure from within his party and the public, promised an in-out referendum on EU membership. He campaigned to remain in the EU, arguing that it was the best way to secure the UK's economic stability and global influence. However, divisions within his party and among the public made the outcome uncertain. The referendum took place on June 23, 2016, with historic turnout of 72%. The result was 51.9% in favour of leaving the EU. This result revealed deep divisions across the UK, with England and Wales largely supporting Brexit, while Scotland and Northern Ireland voted to remain. The Leave campaign, led by figures like Boris Johnson and Michael Gove, focused on themes of sovereignty, control over immigration and reclaiming financial contributions to the EU. In contrast, the Remain campaign warned of economic risks and global isolation.
It was not the result I wanted, nor the outcome that I believe is best for the country I love. But there can be no doubt about the result.
The referendum result sent shockwaves through the political establishment. David Cameron resigned as Prime Minister the day after the vote, paving the way for Theresa May to take over. In March 2017, May invoked Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, formally starting the two-year process withdrawing from the EU.
I hope we can all agree we are now at the moment of decision. And I will make every effort to ensure that we are able to leave with a deal and move our country forward.
However, negotiations with the EU proved far more complex than anticipated. Disagreements over trade, the Irish border, and the rights of EU citizens in the UK led to repeated delays and political stalemates. In July 2019, Theresa May resigned after failing to secure support for the Brexit deal. Boris Johnson succeeded her as Prime Minister, promising to get Brexit done.
Now is the moment for us to get Brexit done and then together to work on building our future partnership.
On January 31st, 2020, the UK officially left the EU, entering an 11-month transition period to finalise future trade and regulatory arrangements.
Do you have any regrets? Any regrets? We're leaving. Freedom, democracy, self-governance.
The transition period ended on December 31st of the same year, when the UK exited the EU single market and customs union. This marked the start of a new chapter in UK-EU relations. 5 years after Brexit, its effects continue to unfold. Politically, Brexit has reshaped the UK, fueling debates about the Union's future, particularly in Scotland and Northern Ireland. Economically, the country has faced both opportunities and challenges, including changes in trade patterns and labour shortages in key sectors.
5 years on from Britain's EU exit, what's the current view on the subject from inside the European project? William Denislow sent this report from Brussels.
Guy, marking the 5-year anniversary of the UK's official departure from the EU, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk took to social media to say, "We still miss you." Tusk was the president of the European Council from 2014 to 2019, during a large chunk of the Brexit negotiations. In his social media post, he also shared a recent poll that shows that support for Brexit in the UK has hit a fresh post-referendum low of 30%. Along with a winking face emoji. The EU remains London's biggest trading partner, making up 40% of its foreign trading goods in 2022. In a sign of easing tensions, Prime Minister Keir Starmer will attend an informal EU leaders retreat next week here in Brussels to discuss key issues such as the war in Ukraine, defence partnerships and relations with the US, now that Donald Trump is president. The EU's Trade Commissioner has also suggested that the UK could join a pan-European customs programme. The UK has ruled out joining a full EU customs union, but says this initiative is something they'll be happy to look at. The EU is also proposing a plan to open avenues for greater youth mobility on both sides of the Channel, but has faced resistance from London. While ties have thawed over recent months, tensions do remain. Just this week, the EU accused the UK at a court of arbitration that a ban on fishing for sand eels in the North Sea was a breach of the post-Brexit EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement. It's the first time the two sides have met in court since the Brexit divorce and could complicate efforts for the UK and EU to find a rapprochement. William Denslow, Frey News, in Brussels.
Back in the UK, strong divisions remain about the success or failure of Brexit and whether to consider rejoining the EU in some form. Let's get more now from Ollie Barrett, who is in London for us. Ollie, always good to see you.
Well, the 5th anniversary, Guy, has really been passing off here in the UK with no fanfare at all coming from the central government, and there is a reason for that, and that's because the new Labour government doesn't want to spend the day celebrating something that was delivered by the previous Conservatives. They also say, the Labour government, that what the Conservatives delivered in terms of a deal for Brexit was, in their words, a botched agreement, and so that they therefore don't believe that this is a day for celebrations. But there's also the element that the new UK government is trying to, in its words, reset ties with the European Union, and again another reason not to be too triumphant on this 5th anniversary. But the other political parties, of course, see this in a very different way. The Conservatives have been celebrating what they say are the achievements and the freedoms of the Brexit and the Brexit deal that they delivered. The Liberal Democrats absolutely reject that. They say that Brexit has failed, and they say that the UK should be heading back into the European Union's customs union and also its single market as well. That is something that the government absolutely rejects and rules out. The Reform Party, led by long-time Brexit campaigner Nigel Farage, they say that Brexit was the right thing to do, but that Brexit hasn't grasped the freedoms and the abilities that it should have done, and therefore hasn't been handled properly, and that they would make sure, if they were to get into government, that they did grasp some of those freedoms that they say are on offer because of Brexit but haven't been taken up. Now, the polling suggests that a majority of British people do now believe that leaving the European Union may have been a mistake, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the UK government is going to follow their wishes in that regard and start trying to talk about heading back into the European Union. There are a number of reasons for that. One is that the government knows it would be hugely controversial. They'd come under huge challenge from some of the parties like the Conservatives and Reform. They'd be accused of being anti-democratic and going back on the results of a referendum held not too long ago. The other reason is that they know that it would completely dominate UK politics for the years to come. If they were to announce another referendum or plans to head back into the European Union, it would absolutely dominate day-to-day politics in this country from that point onwards, and it would overshadow everything else that they're trying to do around the economy, around healthcare, around foreign policy too. So Brexit's 5th anniversary passing off here in the UK fairly quietly.
Ollie, like many other European countries, the UK is struggling to create economic growth at the moment. How much of this is realistic to attribute to Brexit?
That's right. All of these surveys really, and almost all economists agree that Brexit has led to a harm for the overall GDP numbers for the UK economy, that trade in particular has been knocked, that exports, of course, to the European Union have been knocked by some of the non-tariff barriers that have been put in place after Brexit happened. Now, as I say, almost all economists agree in that regard, but many Brexiteers will tell you that Brexit wasn't entirely about economics. It was, they say, about sovereignty and about the ability to legislate here in the UK in various different areas, free from having to go along with European Union agreement or indeed laws coming from Brussels, is certainly how they put it. But when it comes to the economy, Brexiteers also say that being outside the European Union for the long term is the right place to be, because you can go out and you can join the groupings like the CPTPP trading bloc in Asia that the UK has recently become a member of. You can strike trade deals bilaterally with countries around the world. The UK can now go out and try and strike a deal, for example, with the United States in a way that it wouldn't have been able to do if it were part of the European Union. Also worth saying, the UK economy hasn't fallen off a cliff in the way that many anti-Brexit campaigners said that it would in the run-up to the EU referendum. Unemployment hasn't massively spiked in the way that they said it would, but as I say, the Office for Budget Responsibility here in the UK, which is supposedly independent, says that there has been a knock to the UK's overall GDP numbers as a result of Brexit. The vast majority of economists agree, but that doesn't necessarily change the political landscape here in the UK as it currently stands.
Thanks, Ollie. Ollie Barrett for us there in London. Well, let's speak now to someone who is happy about the decision to leave the EU, although maybe not so content with the way that Brexit has been implemented. Mr. Gawain Towler is the former head of communications at Britain's pro-Brexit Reform Party, a friend of Nigel Farage, and still a fierce advocate for the UK's complete independence from the EU. Gawain, thank you very much for joining us on A News. Are we where we're supposed to be then?
No, but there's very good reasons for that. The negotiation was done by a team of people who believed that Brexit was a disaster to be mitigated rather than an opportunity to be grasped. However, there are all sorts of good things. It's just not as many good things as I'd like. Nothing is better than, in a democracy, being able to sack the boss. And whilst you're in the European Union, you cannot sack the boss. And that is that it may be to many people an intangible benefit, but it is a moral benefit of enormous importance for anybody who believes in freedom.
Why does a YouGov poll say that only 3 in 10 people still agree with Brexit?
Well, it's interesting. It depends on how the polls are delivered. If you were to say, do you believe that you should be in the European Union, which would, of course, include membership of the European currency, you'd have to go through the discussions and debates. I mean, it's about 20 billion a year we're not paying into the EU budget. That's just from the original fees. Then you've got another, the VAT receipts that all going to the European Union through the VAT system. They're all being used in the UK for our purposes. I think that there's been an awful lot of naysaying. You've got to remember that even after the referendum, 80% of MPs still believed in our membership of the European Union, despite the result of the vote. You've got to remember that the commanding heights of our academic institutions, our cultural institutions, our political and media institutions all felt that the people of Britain were stupid, arrogant, thick, racist, uneducated ghastlies. And so therefore they spent a lot of time undermining Brexit and putting barriers, legal barriers, this barrier, that barrier. It is no surprise that with that huge power behind them, which they failed effectively in the vote itself to mobilize, but since then they've done an awful lot to downplay all the benefits. And no, I'm not surprised at all. Tell you what, though, if there was another referendum, the arguments would be brought to the fore, and suddenly people would realize what a disaster it would be to rejoin, particularly in the light of the changes in European politics since we have left. It's very interesting that today, the Norwegian government fell apart because the EU was demanding an independent country imposed EU regulations on its own energy industry. There's this colonial mindset amongst our friends on the continent and our friends in Brussels who believe that all policies should be European policies, whether you're a member or not. And so, frankly, the people of this country, my country, Britain, have dodged not just a bullet, but a fusillade of Sam 62s.
Would they be happy about the massive slowdown in nurses that we can train, the reduction in builders, increased red tape?
Nothing is straightforward in this life, but if you talk about the nurses, at the same time we left, or just before we left, the then Conservative government of George Osborne cut the £2,000 a year bursary for nursing for UK citizens. That resulted in a 50,000 drop in people taking up training places. Guess what? We needed 50,000 new nurses to be imported from elsewhere, trained for free, mostly in the third world, making an absolute hash of their economy, taking their skill set, not training our own. So, yeah, you're right. We needed more nurses. But that's because we failed to train our own, and we deliberately did that. Our government did that. Then you look at you're talking about, say, the classic Polish plumber come electrician, all the rest of it. Yeah, fine. You're right, fewer of those, though I think still 5.5 million EU citizens decided to stay on in the UK. So I think we did all right. In that sense, I don't think we can complain about that. But it has been recognised as a fact that the mass importation of skilled or semi-skilled or lower skilled workers has put the clappers on wage increases for the UK population. So some things are good, some things are bad. Even during the Brexit debate in 2016, Lord Sainsbury admitted one of the problems was with Brexit would be upward pressure on wages. Well, that's all very well for a millionaire to say, but for the rest of us, upward pressure on wages is a really good thing.
Well, the UK was promised a cut in immigration, but between the Brexit vote in 2016 and 2023, immigration quadrupled. That's a failure, isn't it?
Utter madness on the part of the Conservative government that made deliberate policies. We've learned in the last 2 days that what's the Boris wave of immigration is being described as. We've learned that for every Zimbabwean nurse who was brought over from Zimbabwe, they brought 10 family members. So to get one nurse, we had to take 11 people, 10 of whom were not skilled, were not high wage, were not the people we needed. So that was a deliberate policy of the Conservative government. And rightly so, their popularity has fallen off a cliff because they lied and lied and lied. But you can't blame that on Brexit. You can blame that on deliberate decisions by British politicians.
Now, the cost of living is at a record high. UK taxes are up. How would you have done it differently?
Well, firstly, we would not have chased down what we think is the fool's paradise of a virtue signal net zero agenda, whacking our energy costs up to the highest in the world. It's preposterous how high they are. And it's going to get worse under this government as well. It wasn't just the Tories. Labour worse than the Tories on this subject. But you cannot have decent investment. You cannot have a lower reasonable cost of living if you've got massive energy costs. A successful society needs low-cost, reliable, sustainable energy. And the drive to net zero has removed all of that. It exports jobs around the world, making life harder for people in Britain. It doesn't export, it exports the climate disease, or it exports carbon dioxide. It doesn't stop the carbon dioxide. It just means it doesn't happen here. So British politicians can polish their virtue, polish their halos, while British workers lose their jobs. That's the bottom line.
And you can never fully have a Brexit, can you, when a part of the UK, Northern Ireland, has a split system of import and export rules. Surely full Brexit is impossible because of Northern Ireland.
But again, this is deliberate choices on behalf of our negotiators. They allowed the wall to go down the Irish Sea. There are currently 300 areas of economic policy that are governed by Brussels and not by Westminster or Stormont and the Northern Irish people themselves. This is the first time, I think, in 300 years that democracy has retreated in this country, where people have less say over their lives. And that is, again, a deliberate decision of the negotiators that went into bat on behalf of Brussels, not London, back in 2016, 17, 18, 19, 20. This did not need to happen. You can have, if you want a wall, we're not going to build a wall. The European Union wants to build a wall across Ireland. They can. We're not going to. But they refused to play ball because the European Union, and they knew full well what they were doing, the European Union allowed and encouraged British negotiators to create this problem. You don't need it. You just don't need it, but it's there. There are ways around it, and I would agree that without the Northern Ireland becoming a full part of the UK again, without it becoming almost a satrap of Brussels, then it's going to be very hard to continue to do our deals.
So what's your hope then? How would you make it work?
I think the Northern Ireland issue has to be dealt with, and there are ways of doing mutual recognition that can sort that out. That is absolutely essential for going forward, I think. It's an arcane issue that if you talk about Northern Ireland to most Brits, their eyes just roll over and they fall asleep. They don't understand the deep importance of it. I think we just have to have confidence. I think what we see is a constant, slow, drip-by-drip divergence, and the coming together is, I think, a false pipe dream from rejoiners. But I do think we just have to have confidence ourselves. We have the freedom to legislate on the interest of the British people rather than the interest of the rest of the world. One can look abroad and look at Argentina, possibly look at what Trump's trying to do in America. Let's see what Pierre Poilievre does in Canada when and if he becomes the prime minister there. I think we can see countries now realizing that the political responsibility of those elected to government is not to look good in international fora, but to work on behalf of the people that elected them. And that is something our government in the UK has singularly failed to do since the referendum and significantly beforehand, which is, after all, one of the main reasons people voted to leave.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Well, that is all we have time for on this edition of News Hour. Please do stay tuned to A News for plenty more news and analysis. And from all of us here in Baku, we wish you a very pleasant evening ahead.